Good evening. Welcome to Church History 1700s. Yes, we're already up the tree, and the 1700s is the flower. Yes, we're on section 7, and the 1700s is packed full. We have revival movements on the church history side. We have musical explosion throughout Western Europe and traveling over to America. What you're listening to with me right now is Johann Sebastian Bach's Christmas Oratorio. And you know, when I lived in Europe and I was living in Germany, every little town had practices starting in September for the Christmas Oratorio. They do that there and the Handel's Messiah, but it is enriched. Oh my, the entire thing is just gorgeous if you have never been able to see it. So much goes on at Christmas here that it's hard to get it all in, isn't it? Yes. And with various lockdowns, you know, there haven't been the concerts. So, but you can pull it up online. Highly recommend it. Johann Sebastian Bach, the Christmas Oratorio. Well, I tell you, to get through this lecture, it's a cold night. I have my little fire here. I have my candles burning, and I have a pot of tea. And you know, this is not a tea talk. This is a history talk. But I thought, I'm not getting through this talk tonight without a cup of tea. So I'm going to pour out, and maybe you should have a cup of tea with me, because this is going to be a very special lecture. The 1700s, as I said, are packed full. I would say revivals, revolutions. You have the American Revolution. We're going to talk about that, and the French Revolution. And you have this fruit. The flower is the perfect word, because the flower, all of this music, this great classical music, and the hymn writing going on, all is a direct result of the Protestant Reformation. Yes. Oh, that's very good tea. It's good, black, brisk, Tetley tea. Now I think we can go on. Okay. I'm going to come back to Bach, but I'm going to let him play, because I just find his music, it's so spiritual, it's so energetic. He's called the fifth apostle. He took all of pure Lutheran Protestant Reformation theology and put it in music. Well, I kind of want to start with a fun story. Have any of you ever bought this big tin? It's the Walker's shortbread tin, and you get it at Costco. Now, this is an old tin, and on this cover is Bonnie Prince Charlie and Flora MacDonald. And it's an amazing true story. It's the romantic Scottish Highlands and the romantic Scottish Hebrides. And it happens in 1700s. Yes. Isn't that amazing? So I thought this would be a really fun story. And this is Flora MacDonald. She's very beautiful. And that's Bonnie Prince Charlie. Now, he was a Stuart. He was the third Charles. And he's called the Pretender because you remember there was Charles the First, who lost his head, remember? And then Charles, the monarch, this is in the 1600s. Then after Oliver Cromwell and the Roundheads ruled, and they had really a parliamentarian form of government, and he was like a prime minister. But after he died, it didn't go on, and they brought back Charles II. This is the House of Stuart, you know. Well, neither of those Charleses were very popular or well-liked. They were autocratic. And so Charles II was removed, and we had William of Orange come from Holland. And, you know, William and Mary, you've heard of William and Mary College. It's named after him. And she had actually been a daughter and of the, but she became a Catholic, but she became Protestant. And they ruled, and they were very well liked and well loved after the, you know, so much chaos and upheaval with all of the throne. They brought a lot of peace, and they were able to take care of the subjects under them with goodness and benevolence and order. So, fast forward, so the Stuarts were off the throne, but this Bonnie Prince Charlie, they call him, he was part of, have you ever heard of the Jacobite uprising in Scotland? And the Jacobite, you know, James is considered the Latin form of Jacob. And so they went back and used the Jacobite uprising, saying that we want to put our Scottish, who was Bonnie Prince Charlie, back on the British throne. Well, it was an uphill battle, and he collected men, and he was pretty rambunctious, and really it was not going to be hopeful, but he kept trying, and he had men following him and won a few battles in Scotland. But when he got to England, it wasn't working out, so he had to flee for his life. Because in those days, you know, if you would come up like that and you were caught, you were going to off with your head, right? Okay, well, he fled up to the Highlands, and Flora MacDonald was a wonderful girl who just lived in the Highlands, a young girl, and he asked her if she would help him. And her uncle and different relatives, they took pity on him, and so they got him in a boat, and they dressed him up like a maid, and he got out, and she helped do it. Well, then after he escaped back to the continent, she got caught, and she got put in the Tower of London. But fortunately, they had a passage of a law that would forgive people that did things of this nature, and she got to go back to Scotland. And so then she married, and they were having problems getting their housing, and so they went to America, she and her husband. Well, then in America, they got a wonderful piece of land, and they were prosperous and blessed. But when the American Revolution came, they took the British side. Oh boy. So they lost all their land and fled back to Scotland. Can you believe it? What an adventurous story. That's Flora MacDonald. Well, it even gets more interesting, because you know the great Samuel Johnson, who was the one who really created the English dictionary, and you've heard of him. He's also living right in the 1760s and 70s, and he decides to make a trip to the Hebrides. He had never left London. Well, in those days, you have to consider you're not going to go by a train. There are no trains. You're going to go by coach as far as you can, then by boat, because the Hebrides are islands in northwest Scotland. Then you're going to go on mules because they didn't really have carriages or roads. And he was in his 60s. He was not that young of a man. And in those days, that was considered pretty up there. And so his companion, who kept all the notes, Bosworth, and wrote his book, wrote his biography, the biography of Samuel Johnson, really worth reading. They also published this book, which my son-in-law gave me as a gift a few Christmases ago, and it's called Samuel Johnson in the Hebrides. Well, he gets up there and he gets, he sees, you know, Loch Ness, and he sees Isle of Skye and Iona and the famous places, the Dungal Caves, and the Hebrides are an amazing, amazing place. And so then he runs into Flora MacDonald in a house party, and he gets acquainted with her, and they write about her, and she's a real person who had all these adventures. And I just love that kind of thing in history. And she's so famous in Scotland for all of her heroism that's why she's on this tin cover and has been forever. Now I noticed this year they changed the cover, but this is the Scotch shortbread. You've seen this, Walker's shortbread, that comes from Scotland, and you can buy it at you know, Costco or any store. It seems like it's in every store now. Well, I'm going to put that down, but that's just a fun little 1700 story. You know, when we study history, we think of these people as statues, but they're real human beings that are just like us. They had the same emotions and feelings, and that book is so interesting, the observations that are made. And Samuel Johnson is a real character. He is a fascinating person to study because he knows everyone, and he goes to Oxford, he lives in London, he's eccentric, he's kind, and he lets a lot of different people live with him in his house, and then he finally marries, and I believe he marries a woman that's a little bit older than him, but they get along, and it's just you will meet so many interesting people by just studying a biography like that. And his people still don't know how he did the dictionary. I mean, it's phenomenal. He did every word. He went through, he had his desk I was in Samuel Johnson's house. It's a museum now in London. And he's got this table and desk that goes all around where he has all his, we must remember, no typewriters. Everything is by hand, and he had to know Latin and Greek and the languages and have people helping him, work with him. And, you know, then later, you know, Noah Webster did a very similar thing in America. But the groundwork was really laid by Samuel Johnson, because something on that level, the lexicon of the English language, had never been codified or created until Samuel Johnson did it. So we owe him a lot. Well, at the same time in the 1700s, in 1703, John Wesley, the famous Methodist preacher, is born in England. And in the same year, in 1703, Jonathan Edwards is born in America. And you know, you'll see, as you study history, often this happens. People are born the same year that do similar important things. And they both lived very long lives, and both really changed history. And Jonathan Edwards was, you know, a congregational minister. He was reformed. He was very brilliant. I think he went to Harvard and Yale I think it was Yale he attended. I think he was 13 years old. And in order to get in, you had to know Greek, Hebrew, and Latin. And he was just this brilliant mind and very devout and very devoted. That was a school for ministers. And there's O Sacred Head Thou Wounded. That's one of my favorite pieces that Bach uses in his oratorio. Well, so you have, Jonathan Edwards, this incredible man that God is going to raise up, and he's going to have revivals, famous revivals. And I read his biography, and it's a fascinating biography. He was not a dramatic preacher like a George Whitefield or even a John Wesley. He spent 12 hours a day in his study. He was a real intellectual, and he would write his sermon out, and he had spectacles or glasses that he wore because he had to read and he had to hold it close, and he read in a monotone. So he wasn't trying to get people to, get excited. He wanted them to be saved and find Christ. But the drama and the reaction was in the people. When they heard the words, it was so powerful that they would fall down and start praying and start repenting. And it was said that even there were areas of miles where a ship would come in and all the people on the ship would start repenting and praying. It was like there were these areas in America that were like holy and sacred, and people would ride their horse and then they'd feel convicted of their sin and they'd have to stop and pray. And Jonathan Edwards was as shocked and amazed at all of it as everyone else was. Well, that was in America. And those revivals, it has been said by even secular historians, if those revivals of Jonathan Edwards had never happened, an American Revolution could never have happened. Because what the revival did, it went all through the denominations. There were so many denominations. There were Methodist, Presbyterian, Anglican, Congregational, Baptist, the Anabaptist, and then the Lutheran, and then there were Catholics in America too. And these revivals, what they did, the denominational barriers fell down and people unified, and they had this harmony spiritually, and it paved the way for people to unify and come together and stand up and say, we will be a free country. The Patrick Henry famous speech, yes, he gave it in the 1700s. He did it on my birthday, March 23rd, 1776. Is life so sweet? Da-dum-da-da. Give me liberty or give me death. That's Patrick Henry. And I think he's a relative of mine because my Scottish name, my family is Hendry, and they all connect. So I'm going to claim him as my own. And another special thing happened on March 23rd, my birthday too. That was the day, if you read the book of Esther, it says the 3rd month, 23rd day, it went out that all the Jews were free. And so I'm going to take that one too. Okay, well, across the ocean, we had John Wesley. And he had a brother named Charles, and there was another friend named George Whitefield. Well, it's a complex story, but John Wesley and Charles Wesley had an incredible mother named Susanna, who had 18 children. Only half of them lived to adulthood. She was extremely well educated, and her husband, Samuel Wesley, the theologians and the ministers were the most well educated in their day, other than lawyers or doctors. And because the Wesleys, Samuel Wesley, had been a dissenter, after they reunited England, a dissenter means they were standing against certain things that were happening in the Anglican Church. Even though they were Anglican, they would be like what we would call Puritans. They wanted to purify the church that had gotten corrupt. But when they reunited the church, anybody that had been a dissenter usually got sent to a really bad parish. And that's why the Wesley family ended up in this town called Ipswich. And it was such a bad parish. The only people in the whole town that could read or write were the Wesley children and the Wesley family. And so Samuel Wesley was trying to minister to these people and bring them to Christ, and they were so hateful. They were drinkers of gin, and they had alcoholic problems. They were fighters and brute and rough and corrupt and just... And do you know what they did? This is unbelievable. Here, all the Wesley family were in the parsonage in bed at night, and with the children all asleep, sound asleep, someone lit the house on fire. Yes, they did. And it went up in flames. And all of the Wesleys had gotten out, except they looked up, and there in the window was little John. I think he was 8. And there's his mother and father, and the house is full in flames. And so the townspeople said, okay, let's build shoulder to shoulder. So they stood on top. They made a human ladder up to there and just miraculously got him out just in the nick of time. And his mother, Susanna, stood there and she said, my Johnny, he's a brand rescued from the burning. I must give myself to more prayer for him. God has preserved him for a reason and a purpose. And that's really what happened. Because, and Susanna Wesley was very disciplined. She would spend the day of the child's birthday all day in prayer for that child. She was very devout, and she had an apron, and she would put it over her head sometimes to have a private little closet to pray in, because there's so many people in the house, and they had servants, of course, because in those days everyone did, because you didn't have a washer, a dryer, or a dishwasher, or even barely a stove, you know, probably outside plumbing. So what happened then was Susanna, she trained her children to never demand their own way. She had a method to cry softly, and at the age of 5, it was all home education. It was up to her because there were no schools. And she taught them, she had a method that at the age of 5, she would teach them the whole alphabet in one day. And from there, she would move them on to reading, and the scripture, of course, had a very vital part. She also knew Greek and Latin. She was very well educated, and she was very, I believe that they fasted 1 or 2 days a week. I know that John Wesley, when he was an adult, always fasted, I believe, Monday and Thursday until 3 o'clock. And then they would have a meal. So it wasn't, you know, hopelessly impossible. But John Wesley, he could never have performed his duties and had such a success in ministry, or Charles, without their mother and father. And Charles was a younger brother. So John went to Oxford, and they had very little money. He had very little to live on. He had to wait tables and work his way through. Even though he was a minister's son, and even though he was very bright. And he said, you know, all of this has made me stronger. The suffering can make us, you know, the gold has to go through the fire sometimes. Well, then Charles Wesley came, and they had a friend named George Whitefield who came. And they were very serious young men, and they said, let's spend a certain amount of time every day praying and reading our Bibles, and let's go and use our spare time to help the poor and help little children that can't read and write, create a little school for them. And that's what they did. And they were so disciplined and so orderly in their life that the other students at Oxford laughed at them. They probably felt convicted because they were living very sloppy lives. But so they called them Methodists. And that's where the name came from. It was never a name that John Wesley used. It was a slang term because they had a method. They were Anglican ministers being trained. And Charles was a musician, and he wrote thousands of hymns. He wrote the most beautiful hymns. Well, then what John and Charles and George Whitefield, they started preaching on, and they would bring people into the church, and they were getting results, and people loved to hear them preach. But then they would bring people into the church that, oh, the snobby, older, wealthy, aristocratic people said, this is riff-raff. We can't have the riff-raff in the church. So John said, okay, the world is my pulpit. And he went out and started having open air meetings, and that's where that came from. Then George Whitefield followed. And George Whitefield later went to America and had massive revivals. He would preach to 20 and 30,000 people in a field. No one knew how it really worked, that they could hear. But Benjamin Franklin writes about it, and he said, that's the greatest preacher I've ever heard. He said, every time I have to leave any valuable at home because I'm so moved by the Spirit, I have to put it in the offering. I gave last time my gold watch, and he felt the Holy Spirit moving him so much. Well, that was George Whitefield, and that was later. But before that happened, John Wesley and Charles made a trip to America. And John was so deep and so serious about his own soul, he couldn't get peace, and he felt like, how do I really know I'm saved? You know, kind of like what Martin Luther went through. Many great men go through that. And then he was on a boat, and there were a group of Moravians there. And the Moravians had come from Germany, and they were a group of very pietistic Christians, and Count von Zinzendorf had become, he was a wealthy man, and he gave his money to build a beautiful center for them and send them to America. And then he came to America, and he established an amazing center. And Benjamin Franklin also talked about them, and he said their music is so beautiful. Well, when John Wesley met them on the boat, it was a terrible storm, and everyone in their natural mind would be terrified. John Wesley was terrified. But he said, they're so calm and peaceful. What do they have? What do they have? And he asked them, and he said, well, they said, well, we trust the Lord. We know God loves us. He's going to take care of us, and we've given our lives completely to him. Wow. Well, John Wesley thought he had given his life too, but he was really touched by this. And he didn't have any success in America that time when he went. He would preach, but he didn't have much success, and he went home a little bit discouraged. But when he went to London, he went to the bookshop of Peter Böhler, who was also part of that Moravian movement. And they were having a little meeting in the bookshop that night. They had closed it, and they had a meeting. Well, John Wesley was sitting there, and Peter Böhler actually read Martin Luther's sermon on Galatians, and then about the just shall live by faith. And do you know, as John Wesley sat there, this is really interesting, he said, my heart was strangely warmed, and I knew that God loved me. And the rest was history. And isn't it interesting? It went back to Martin Luther, who went through the same experience. So sometimes the seeking after God is important, because then we really, when we find him, it's so real. It's our experience. Well, then John Wesley went home and talked to his parents and started preaching, and everything was different. He started having hundreds of people come to his meetings. And you know, there's the most beautiful expression, because at that time in history, when you were poor, you were poor. There was no welfare. You were just practically a beggar, and you just scrape along if a little bit of work here or there. Well, it said that everywhere John Wesley went, if he would go into squalor and filth, he would leave behind him beauty and order. Isn't that beautiful? And then Charles, his brother, started writing these hymns. You know, oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing my great Redeemer's praise. That's just one of them. He wrote so many. He took all this theology of freedom in Christ and put it into hymns. And so they would sing. Charles would lead the music. John would preach. And then George Whitefield started preaching. And then George Whitefield decided to go back to America and had this tremendous success. So you have these tremendous revivals. This is an era of revival. And then George Whitefield went and met Jonathan Edwards. And Jonathan Edwards and him became very close friends. And so they were all connecting with each other. And so much was going on at once. It's just tremendous. Well, then when you had, like I said, these conditions in England, oh my goodness, they were so terrible. And that, out of that is where you get, there was a man named Raikes, R-A-I-K-E-S. And he found the Lord at one of these Wesley meetings. And he said, these children, we have to do something for these poor, pitiful children. And so he hired 4 women to start a Sunday school, because these children were working during the week. There were no schools for them. And he hired them, and they would, and it's quite interesting, I have it written right here, that they would go have a whole day. The original Sunday school was not just, going to a little 15-minute class and then going to church. No. It was a whole situation, and it was, I wanted to find him, and I wanted to read this because I thought it was so fascinating. And you see how one thing leads to the next, because you had this Count Nicholas von Zinzendorf giving his money, and that before him was a man named Philip Spener, and he was a German Lutheran pastor who became concerned about the spiritual coldness and lack of moral consciousness in Germany. And he was born in 1635 and died in 1705, so it's really early. He felt the state interfered too much, because you see, Lutheranism became a state religion. And he felt like there wasn't enough of, real personal conversion. And then there was another man that was very affected, and his name was August Frank. And he was a young professor at the University of Leipzig. And he had been, he went and had a position at the University of Halle. And Frank taught Greek and Oriental languages. And then he started a school for poor children and publishing and distributing Bibles. And it's the same pattern. Well, then over in England, what I had said after the Wesley revivals, you had this wonderful, wonderful reforms. You had a prison reform. Well, you had William Wilberforce. There would never have been a William Wilberforce and Pitt the Younger, who helped him, the prime minister, stopping the slave trade if it hadn't been for a John Wesley, because John Wesley had preached, and then, remember John Newton, the one who was a slave trader, and then he wrote the famous song Amazing Grace. He found the Lord. This is all revivals. And this wonderful man, though, that founded this Sunday school, Raikes, it's Raikes, and what he did was so wonderful for the children, because he gave them meals, and he gave them, these women taught them to read and write, and then to study the Bible. And then you had prison reform. No one had even cared about the prisoners. I mean, you had the debtors' prisons where whole families, you've seen it in the Charles Dickens movies, right? Where the whole family has to go live in the debtors' prison. And it was so sad, because they had no way then of earning money, of ever getting out of debt. I mean, it was just a trap set for them. But you have all of these wonderful Christian people that come out because God puts it on their heart. And then we had the same time the great English lawyer William Blackstone, 1723 to 1780. He went about visiting every church in London, but he could not find, he said, according to Bishop Ryle, he did not hear a single discourse which had more Christianity in it than the writing of Cicero, and it would have been impossible for him to discover it had gone cold. And that's why these revivals came. So John Wesley, the Anglican clergy, they didn't like him because he was too excited, too happy, preaching and getting people saved and bringing people in that they, like I said, they were not interested in. And then, we have in France at this time the Enlightenment going on, because, I don't know, you remember the Louis, there's the 3 Louis, and then that he wanted the aristocrats to become indolent, because that's why he could have autocratic power and control. So, they created Versailles, and the people didn't have anything to do, the wealthy, and they sat around talking. And so then they were curious, and that's part of that really fomented the Enlightenment that came to France. People started saying, well, what do we believe, and who are we? But sadly, it went with Voltaire, and it went into a godless view, and preempted the French Revolution. Yes, which was a revolution that was not based on law. It was not based on order. It was based on mob rule and the guillotine. And they, each level would kill the other level. But in the American Revolution, it was based on the law. And the law said that, you cannot have taxation without representation. And so that was the foundation and basis for the American Revolution. And of course, during that time in the 1700s, we have a whole nother group of brilliant founding fathers. We have John Adams. John Adams and his wife, Abigail, remind me a lot of the Wesley family. They're very disciplined. They all keep journals every day. They watch their time. They are very, very well trained in Greek, Hebrew, and Latin and English. And John Wesley, just like John Adams, is very called and very serious about his life. And Then you have, of course, Thomas Jefferson. And you have these wonderful people who are are seeking to create a nation. And then we have what we were listening to at the beginning. I want to show you. We have Johann Sebastian Bach. I have so many pages on him. I wanted to find the special one I had. But this is his organ that he originally played on and wrote so many that you can go see today. And Bach was happy. You know, the interesting thing is, people that know the Lord are happy. And Bach really had a lot of joy. And that doesn't mean that he had an easy life. This is the desk. I find it fascinating. Bach sat at that desk and wrote his music. He didn't sit at a piano or a harpsichord or a pipe organ. He sat at a desk. You know why he could do that? Because the music was in his head. He was a genius. Now, when I went to Europe last time, I really discovered, here's Mozart, and I'll give you his dates. Mozart, 1756, 1791. During his short lifetime, Mozart composed over 600 works. He began composing at the age of 5, wrote his first symphony when he was 9 years old. The young composer quickly became a famous child prodigy in Austria. His beautiful compositions for keyboard helped make the piano a popular instrument. And do you know, Thomas Jefferson actually met Mozart. And because Thomas Jefferson played the violin too. But he wasn't so crazy about Mozart's music. He loved Bach. Bach is spiritual. Mozart is more of the mind. And then we have Beethoven, 1770 to 1827. And we all know Beethoven. And he is really the soul. He has the soul. So many people, this is agreed upon by many musicologists, Bach has that spiritual, Mozart has the mind, and Beethoven has the soul. Well, you would not have really had a Mozart or a Beethoven without Johann Sebastian Bach. I just heard this week on Classical King FM again that Mozart considered Bach his teacher, even though he didn't have formal lessons. They learned from, each other. And Beethoven also completely gave Bach the credit. Bach was like a breakthrough person and did things that had not been done ever. Here is a picture of Bach with his family. He ended up having about 18 children. He had 2 marriages. His first wife died, and then he married, I have a beautiful song that he wrote. I used to sing for his second wife, Maria, and she helped him so much. And they were all musicians. They all played. They all sang. And Bach was the youngest child and of a large family. And then his mother died and his father died before he was 12. And I've heard it said, often the youngest child does the greatest things. And really important to consider that. You think about families, think about the Bible, you think about Joseph, he was a youngest. Yes, David was a youngest. Isn't that interesting? And I just think large families are beautiful. And if God gives children, receive them all as a gracious gift. God will provide. If these people in these times could make it and be provided for, we don't have to worry. God has enough for everyone. Here's a real picture of his organ. And Bach, on every piece of music he wrote, he put "to the glory of God alone." There's his picture. And, you know, he had his, there's always politics in music and the struggles. And they didn't have much money. Of course, they wasn't getting paid much, but they made it. They made it, and he kept, you know, I love about Bach, he kept writing, writing, writing. I think I told you before that I believe that they said a person could start sitting at a desk and copying right now, and it would take 80 years to copy all of Bach's music. And much of it was even lost. He was the most prolific writer that ever has been. And, you know, there's a Bible in his museum, and he has so much underlined of, like, where the King Solomon was anointed and the service of the temple. It's all underlined. He understood what he was doing. Here, let me read something to you. His underlining and marginal comments give us a window into his personal faith. Bach's preaching reflected what he read. The many sermon collections and commentaries in his personal library provided him with the necessary background for composing cantatas that interpreted and proclaimed the word. Only one item from Bach's library survives. As far as we know, the 3-volume Deutsche Bibel, the German Bible, edited by Abraham Kallov, was published 1681 to 82. Kallov inserted Luther's comments on various scripture passages. If he could not find a comment by Luther, Bach supplied his own. The Kallov Bible commentary is a vital source for understanding Bach's approach to scripture. Each volume contains Bach's handwritten monogram. Bach underlined many passages in both red and black ink, and most importantly, wrote his own comments in the margins. These markings give us a glimpse into Bach's personal beliefs and how he understood his vocation. Here are a few examples. Exodus 15 records the song of praise sung antiphonally by those who had been released from slavery in Egypt, when Moses leading the men and Miriam leading the women. Alongside verse 20, he puts Miriam, the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women went out after her with timbrels and dances. Bach wrote, "Note this well," and he used it for a first prelude for 2 choirs to be performed to the glory of God. Chronicles 25 lists all the members of the musical families, Asaph, Heman, Jeduthun, who were given the responsibility to lead the worship and prophesy with the harps and the psalteries and the cymbals. In the margin, Bach wrote, "This chapter is the true foundation of all God-pleasing church music." Wow. 1 Chronicles 28:21 reads, "Here are the divisions of the priests." And alongside, Bach wrote, "Splendid proof that besides other arrangements of the service of worship, music too was instituted by the Spirit of God through David." So it goes on, and if you want I think I sent you these notes. I sent you these. Bach said the aim and final end of all music should be none other than the glory of God and the refreshment of the soul. You know, he had to write a different cantata every Sunday. That's why there's so much music. And read those notes I gave you, because they're really worth spending time with. Bach will inspire you, and then you can pull up his music online and listen to it while you're reading. Do you know, Leonard Bernstein, who is Jewish, and I don't know that he was even a practicing Jew. I don't know what his full belief system was. But I heard him give a lecture on St. Matthew's Passion that Bach wrote. And he said, this is the greatest piece of music ever composed. That every part of it, even when Christ is carrying the cross and going up to, Calvary, the music patterns it. And I tell you, when I was really young, I went to St. Matthew's Passion, and I didn't have the intellectual capacity to fully comprehend it, but I know in my spirit I felt it. I felt something so deep. Oh, and there's one of the arias in German is Gehabe I have enough. And it, in other words, it's Jesus, Jesus, you are enough. Gehabe It's so deep and it repeats itself. It will heal you. Bach's music will heal you. And because of not being able to go to a lot of concerts, just go online and find a good one. Maybe you have to look a little bit, but there's so much there. And then follow along with the words of the St. Matthew's Passion, the St. John's Passion, and then this Christmas oratorio. And plus all his other things he did. I mean, oh my. I mean, as soon as Bach comes on, my classical king, I feel this lift. He worships. And as far back in the generations as they can find in Bach, there were musicians. I believe he goes way back. And he was God's man. It was like God chose people. God chose Jonathan Edwards. God chose George Whitefield. God chose John and Charles Wesley. God chose Samuel Johnson to do a dictionary. God chose the founding fathers, to found America. God chose these musicians, Bach, to so the 1700s, it is a rich, rich era. And I'm just barely scratching the surface. And that's what is so frustrating about trying to give a talk in an hour. But I hope I've given you real food for thought. And, because the next century we're going to go to is the 1800s. And, Charles Dickens is in the 1800s, and he writes that famous book, Tale of Two Cities, London and Paris, French Revolution. That is a moving book. Every Christmas, we watch the 1935 movie that was made, and it's so well done. Tale of Two Cities. Pull it up and watch it. And it really explains, and you'll get a real feeling for what the 1700s were like. And I haven't even talked about all the other authors and authoresses. Jane Austen, she's born in the 1770s and she lives into the 1800s, but she's right there. And then the beautiful author who wrote, that wonderful, The Scottish Chiefs, can't remember her name, but she is looked to as a real, she was a first. These were first. And you have Defoe, and you have the writing of Robinson Crusoe. You have a lot of wonderful early, I'm leaving so many out. I know that there are just so many in that English literature period. And, Sir Walter Scott, he admired Jane Austen so much. And he was right at the very early 1800s, but he's coming off that 1700s because he looked to Jane Austen, and he wrote the first historical novels, the Waverley novels, and oh my goodness, he wrote so much. And he also admired Samuel Johnson, and Jane Austen admired Samuel Johnson. All these people, it's like nothing is born in a vacuum. There's the beginning, and Samuel Johnson inspires everyone, and he has the people that he's inspired by. And then you also have, you know, Annals of the World written by Ussher. And he's a bishop, Protestant bishop in Ireland. He wrote that tremendous book. It's in the other room. It's so big I can hardly lift it. Oh my goodness, this is such a rich, rich period because, you know, we had the Protestant Reformation, 1515, remember? And all those 1500s coming up, the printing press, the writing, the translation of the Bible, which gave everybody, we have Shakespeare and Queen Elizabeth I. And then remember, we went into the 1600s where we had Puritans. And then we also had the, not just the Puritans. Remember my P's. Now, what I got to remember them, but we had that whole movement that in the 1600s, the Pilgrims. That was my other P. We had the Pilgrims that then had the Bible, and then you had John Foxe writing Foxe's Book of Martyrs, and you had John Bunyan writing Pilgrim's Progress. Remember all these great books? Well, that fed into, and John Milton, you know, and so that fed into then the 1700s. 1600s colonial days, 1700s still colonial days, but then we have a nation being born. We have the 1776 Declaration of Independence, and then we have the War of Independence, and then we have, and that, you know, of course the Declaration was written by Thomas Jefferson, and then we have the Articles of Confederation, and we have all the Founding Fathers meeting at the Continental Congress. We have so much. There is so much going on. And it's an exciting century. I guess every century is, but this is particularly for America and for a birthing of great things. And I didn't even give the full list that comes out of the John Wesley revivals, but you know, he had to give the people something other than when they got delivered of gin, because that liquor had destroyed those families. And he would go in and he would create schools, hospitals, and give the people work to do. They would, you know, learn crafts and skills. Well, he had to give them a drink to drink, and it was tea. And in one of my tea books, it attributes John Wesley. They were called the teetotalers, remember? Because they wouldn't drink liquor or alcohol. And then that continued. We're going to learn next time in the 1800s, we're going to learn about, you know, General Booth and the Salvation Army. He took many, many, many of the John Wesley ideas and then went to the next level with that. And so all these reforms that you have in the charities, they all go back to the Bible. The Red Cross even has a cross. The hospital work, all those wonderful Catholic sisters that came, the Franciscans, all in our area, St. Joseph and the Franciscan system, all the hospitals are, it took love. It took a lot of hard work, and Christian charity, that's where it all comes from the Bible. Well, it's been wonderful to be with you. I hope you enjoyed this. You know, it's Christmas, and I'm a little late on this lecture, but you know, I went on a long trip with my husband. We went all the way down to Arizona to see our family for Thanksgiving, and then we traveled back and we saw the Grand Canyon and Sedona and Zion National Park. So I had a rich, rich experience. But now we're back online with you, and we're going to finish this out. And next time we will do the 1800s if you want to read ahead, which is the beautiful Victorian era. So, well, thank you so much for joining me, and have a beautiful, beautiful Christmas. And I may post another one before, but we'll be getting this wrapped up, and I will have a test at the end, and I'm going to make it a fun test. I'm going to make it an open book test. We are going to enjoy our history. My entire goal is to make you love it and teach you how to study on your own and become golden scholars and to self-educate. Yes. Well, God bless, and enjoy this, and read the handouts I gave you. They're very rich. If you can't read them now, keep them in your notebook, and in the new year you can always look back. Okay, thanks. God bless. Happy studying. Bye-bye.